All right, well, thanks for coming out tonight. Last lecture of the season is Aristophanes. Now, several people have commented to me that, well, everyone remembers Aristophanes, more or less, right? We haven't forgotten Aristophanes. But I think what we've forgotten or has been overlooked is that Aristophanes is a significant thinker. He's not just one of the great comic playwrights in history, I would say one of the top. I mean, he's just one of the greatest comedic playwrights on just the merits of his comedy. His plays are unbelievably funny, even, 2,000 years later. But significantly, I think what has been forgotten, and hence part of the Forgotten Thinker program, is that Aristophanes was an insightful, in fact, incredibly precise, careful, and humane thinker about the condition of man in his time, and how we should reflect on that and what we should do about it. And this gets lost, I think, because we have a hard time taking comedy seriously, which you're not supposed to take comedy seriously, right? So, but wrapped in his comedy was a lot of very insightful, and I think what his history has proven to be correct, insight about his own times, the problems, and how they could or should have been addressed. So one reason I think that we've forgotten him is we tend to look at philosophical history through the lens of our own concept of what philosophy is, and that is a take of academic philosophy. And academic philosophy really gets kicked off mostly with Kant, and it's not that that's wrong, but Kant and Hegel set a pattern for what it means to do philosophy, and that was widely adopted both in content and in form by almost everybody who came after. And so it meant, you had to have a system. It had to be rigorous, it had to be organized, it had to be correct. You were trying to get big truths, capital T, truths, ontologically accurate claims, demonstrable for all time, all space, and all dimension. When the scientific revolution kicks off, not too much later than that, it really becomes important because all of a sudden science does seem to be delivering truth. So if science can deliver truth, what is philosophy for? Well, philosophy has to deliver even more truth. And so this sort of truth arms race between philosophy and science gets kicked off, which I think is pointless and unhelpful and in fact poisonous. And so retrospectively, we look back at philosophy from that viewpoint and we say what philosophy is supposed to be doing is presenting a system. It's got to be highly organized, and it has to be rational and logical, and it has to be advocating or demonstrating or claiming to provide irrevocable absolute truths. Which is, again, there is a part of philosophy that does that, but this is a very narrow view of what philosophy could or can be, and certainly it's an inaccurate view on what it was. Socrates had no system. Plato claimed to have a system. It's not clear he did have a system. He had a lot of systems, one could say. Aristotle certainly did have a system, but not of precisely the same kind that we get later. And so all kinds of philosophers from all kinds of ages sort of have gotten pushed out because they don't conform to what we now think of as philosophy. But thinkers throughout the ages have done a lot of serious thinking without having the burden of large systems or significant contemplation of ontology. Generally speaking, they're really interested in the question of, what can we do to live better? And in a given time, in a given place, facing a given set of problems. And so we look back at someone like Aristophanes, who certainly does not have a system, by the way. He's a comic playwright. But he is more than that, and I think that's what's key. And I think it's one reason his plays hold up for thousands of years, is because he wasn't just funny. He was funny with an edge, and there's always something there that carries more weight than his plays ought to have, considering that they're incredibly farcical, which we'll also talk about. One thing we forget, and this I think gives us an idea that he was in fact serious, is that the most famous dialogue, or the most famous sort of work in philosophical history of the West, is almost certainly the Symposium by Plato. Everybody remembers that Socrates is there. Nobody remembers that anybody else was there, right? It is a conversation amongst several people, one of whom is Aristophanes. And as far as I'm concerned, Aristophanes gets the best line. Because he's Aristophanes, it's funny. And because he's Aristophanes, he's also incredibly human. So I want to read this because I believe this is the first historic example of the argument we're about to read. So this is where I want to start from. It's an extended quote, but it's significant because it tells us a whole lot about Aristophanes, but it also tells us that Plato thought enough of Aristophanes as a thinker to include him in the Symposium. He could have edited him out. He did not have to have him there. But he thought Aristophanes was a sufficiently important person to include his presence and his argument. So I had to edit down a little bit, but this is roughly it. It's not too much longer than this. So they've been arguing about love, the nature of attraction, the nature of who you should be attracted to. And the first couple of speakers have delivered these sort of complex invocations of Eros and Aphrodite and the spiritual and the incredible power of the gods and the inspiration that they provide. And later on, Socrates will do something similar to that, except for much longer and much more involved, right? The big Socratic reflection on this. And in between it all, Aristophanes apparently sort of raises his hand and says, yeah, that's all very nice and well and good. So let me tell you a story about how it really happened back from where mankind came from, the beginning, from the gods. So one thing, he's mocking their invocation of the gods, which is important to remember. But here's what he says. He says, originally, the sexes were not two as they are now, but originally three in number. There was man, woman, and the union of the two, having a name corresponding to the double nature, which had once a real existence, but is now lost, and the word androgynous is only preserved as a term of reproach. In the second place, the primeval man was round, his back and his sides forming a circle, and he had 4 hands and 4 feet, one head with 2 faces, looking opposite ways, set on a round neck, and precisely alike, also 4 ears, 2 privy members, and the remainder to the correspond. He could walk upright as men do now, backwards or forward as he pleased, and he could also roll all over and over at a great pace, turning on his 4 hands and 4 feet, 8 in all, like a tumbler going over and over with their legs in the air. And this was when he wanted to run fast. At this point, he goes in this dialogue about how then we got arrogant and decided to make war on the gods because we could just roll around and make all this noise and we're so powerful, we're so fast. Right, so this is hilarious, by the way. There's no evidence that anybody ever believed this ever in the history of anything, that we were stuck together, we had 4 arms, 4 legs, 4 feet. It's just this crazy. But he's doing it, sort of delivering it in that serious Aristophanes way. But, let me tell you, this is what happened. This is really what happened, guys. At last, after a good deal of reflection, Zeus discovered a way to defeat the humans. He said, methinks I have a plan which will humble their pride and improve their manner. Men shall continue to exist, but I will cut them in 2. And then they will be diminished in strength and increased in number. This will have the advantage of making them more profitable to us. So ancient is the desire of one another which is implanted in us, reuniting our original nature, making one of 2, and healing the state of man. His argument here is straightforward. We used to be joined. When we got cut in half, we developed this longing to gain our lost part, to regain what we had by the union with another person who makes us for the half that is missing. Originally we had 2 parts, now we're 1, and we desire strongly to reunify with what was cut away from us. But what was the cut away from us? Each of us, when separate, has one side only. Men who are a section of that double nature, which was once called androgynous, are lovers of women, because they're originally a man and a woman stuck together, hence androgynous, are lovers of women. Adulterers are generally of this breed, also adulterous women who lust after men. The women who are a section of the women do not care for men, but have female attachments. If originally you were stuck together as 2 women, then you're going to long for a woman. Of course, similarly, but they who are a section of the male follow the male. Wherefore, let us exhort all men to piety, that we may avoid evil and obtain the good of which love is to us the Lord and minister. And let us to no one oppose him, he is the enemy of the gods who oppose him. For if we are friends of God and at peace with him, we shall find our true loves, which rarely happens in this world at present. To not allow people to join with those with whom they are naturally attracted is a sin against the gods. It is in our natures to love those to whom we are attracted to. And that is a gift from the gods. Whomever you are attracted to is who you should be with, because this makes you complete. To do otherwise is impious. It's a sin against the gods. It's a beautiful, I think, metaphor. And it invokes a very sort of modern sentiment. But notice he does it in this hilarious way. Everybody else is invoking the gods, so he's going to invoke the gods. Everybody else is creating or reciting these ancient mythos, so he's going to create his own ancient mythos, in which human beings used to be stuck together with 8 legs, and they rolled around, and they were so scary and powerful, the gods cut them in half. Which is hilarious. I just think this is hilarious, particularly when it's in the sort of, not the middle, but sort of the middle third of the Symposium, weighed between these very serious, erudite, pious and deep philosophical arguments. Aristophanes is like, oh God, really guys? No, time out, not that complicated. Some men love men, some men love women, some women love men, some women love women. What's the problem? Love is a joy. It's great. It's a gift from the gods. It's impious to interfere with that. Everything else, nonsense. So this is his model. Hilarious, but with this humane and I think essentially correct and beautiful underpinning. And it comes up over and over again. He doesn't like abstraction. He doesn't like excess of crazy, which is the structure of a lot of Greek argument, is the invocation of all these crazy myths and gods. Socrates does this all the time. To make these long, drawn-out, ethereal, there's a soul and there's a higher plane and there's a plane above that and the souls go up. And he's like, no, come on, forget that. No, it's not that complicated. Let people love who they want, because that's what the gods want, because love is a wonderful thing. It's a gift from the gods. Impious not to enjoy it. Impious to interfere with other people. So that's his argument in the Symposium. You can read 10,000 pages of comment on the Symposium. They'll never mention Aristophanes. He's just been written out. And I think he's written out consistently for the same 2 reasons. One, he's funny. And so we go, oh, come on, what is this hermaphroditic and androgynous things rolling about scaring the gods? I don't know. And then 2, then he's just very simple and down to earth and straightforward. And this pattern just repeats throughout pretty much the entirety of his works, which are, by the way, even, again, at this remove, hilarious. So we'll talk about that. So that I just wanted to open with that, to remember that he's in the Symposium for a reason. Plato put him there for a reason. We've forgotten that he's there. Culturally, maybe not individually, but as a culture, we do not remember that he's there anymore. He's just been vanished off of the stage because he's not Socrates. It's too funny and too simple. But if you read any of his plays, you could break them down. I wasn't sure how to organize this, so I decided I would just go with some of his central arguments that recur in more than one play, and then sort of give you an outline of where you could look at this. So one of his big ones is the pleasures of peace and his opposition to war, sort of dual argument here. And it's important to note that most of his adult life, Aristophanes lived at the time of the Peloponnesian War, the sort of ruinous war between Sparta and Athens that ended up with the conquest of Athens and the destruction of much that was good and noble in the Athenian culture. He was opposed to this war. He thought this war was stupid. And he did not hold back on this very much at all. His fundamental reason is not that he was a pacifist. He just thought it was ruinous and wrong-headed for Athens and Sparta, 2 Greek cultural entities, to fight what he considered to essentially be a civil war, while the enemies, the real enemies of the Athenian world, of the Greek world, more broadly, were lurking out there to conquer them. He thought it weakened Athens inside of Athens. It weakened them and made them subject to be overtaken by an oligarchy or a tyranny, by the way, exactly what happened. And also weakened them externally, making them prey to forces that might be aggressive and want to conquer Athens or the Greek world, which is, of course, exactly what happened. So he's right and right. So the plays to look at here for the pleasures of peace, I mean, there is a lot of them, but the most famous is the Lysistrata, the Acarnanians, and Peace. I just want to look at one called Peace, right? That's very subtle of him. So probably his most famous play is Lysistrata. People are familiar at all with Lysistrata? So this is again, an unbelievably hilarious and body work. I think virtually unperformable. I've never seen a convincing performance. I've never read of a convincing performance. Because what the two trends here, very modern play in some ways, is the women of Athens want to stop the war with Persia, and with Persia, strike that with Sparta, and they want to stop the war because all of their husbands and sons are being killed. This is important to note that there's a serious underpinning, despite the fact that there's this hilarious body exterior. So they have a twofold plan. One, we're going to go on a sex strike, and two, we're going to seize the Temple of Athena, essentially the Bank of Athens. That's where all the money is. And they figure if we seize the cash and give the men no sex, they're certainly going to give in, and they're going to give in fast. Right? And so all of the action of the play revolves around those two themes. And they're all mixed up, and it's hilarious. So on one hand, it really is funny because you get this sex strike play, which means that for much of the play, the women are making sex jokes and sort of posing in the temple where the money is, and exposing themselves and making all these innuendo to the men who all wander around with huge erect phalluses because they can't have sex. Right, and they're always grabbing each other's phalluses, and so it's just X-rated and just body beyond belief. And every line, I swear, I'd say every second line is a sex joke, and I think every other line we're missing it because we don't know what it was referring to at the time. I mean, at some level, it's double and triple entendre the entire time. It's not subtle most of the time. And we know we're missing a lot of it, which means it's 100% sex jokes. And very graphic sex jokes at that. At the same time, it's important to remember the setting of this. These plays were performed at a Dionysian festival at which every significant member of the Athenian male society, of course, forget women, all the significant men would be there. All of the generals who were leading the war, who weren't currently on the battlefield, the admirals, the most important elected officials, the people who had voted for the war, the people who were going to have to fight in the war, the people who were just back from fighting in the war, would be sitting in the audience. And so when Lysistrata comes out and says, look, we've got to stop this ridiculous war, it's them. It's the people in the audience. It's not like, there's no remove. It's not like a show that's on TV that someone in the White House might hear about, oh, you're being criticized over there. No, they're sitting in front of them. There are many places where they actually name specific leaders. The characters in the play yell at them because they're in the audience. Which is incredible. I mean, it's just so weird for us to think about. It's as if you have all of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the President, the Vice President, the head of the Senate, head of the Congress, and there's a play going on where all the people in the play are yelling at the people at the people attending here. And Aristophanes wasn't shy about this. If you look at some of the quotes he says about himself on the front page, he says, for even a comedy knows what is right, and what I'll say, though startling, is right. This is from one of his plays. Even now, you silly men, it is not too late to change your ways. The poet declares he deserves to receive rewards for the good he has done you. In the plays itself, he tells the people, look, I know this is a comedy, but pay attention. This is important. We're doing wrong-headed, dangerous, painful things. So we have this great quote from the Lysistrata here, where she says, what matters that I was born of women? If I can cure your misfortunes, I pay my share of tolls and taxes by giving men to the state. But you miserable graybeards, you contribute nothing to the public charges. On the contrary, you have wasted the treasures of your forefathers, as it was called, the treasures amassed in the days of the Persian wars. You pay nothing at all in return, and into the bargain you endanger our lives and liberties by your mistakes. Have you one word to say for yourselves? Don't irritate me, you there, or I'll lay my slipper across your jaws, and it's a pretty heavy slipper. You there. This is out to the audience. Lysistrata is not talking to people on stage. She's talking to people in the audience. Look, you old bastards. You're stealing our money. You're ruining the state. She actually at one point turns to the audience and says, you're killing my children. It's a very direct charge, because they are. So on one hand, funny. On the other hand, not so funny. Incredibly bawdy. And it seems to be the way he got away with this is just because he was the funniest playwright ever. I mean, he's just hilarious. And so people were laughing, but it was always a painful laugh, or often a painful laugh. So that's one of them. Another example is the Acarnanians, in which, shockingly, one citizen decides, whose name I always get, Diacolopus, I always get it wrong. Anyway, one citizen, the main character of the play, he says, well, forget this war. I'm going to make my own separate peace. So he goes and negotiates successfully peace for himself and his family. That's the whole theme. Of course, this is treasonous, right? I mean, everybody's clear. You can't do this. This would be treason. But that's the whole subject of the play. But it really is just an opportunity to say, look, this is rude. You're destroying our families. We're starving. In this case, the main character's big problem is he's rural. He's not from the city. And because the Athenians could not match the Spartans on land, they just told everybody who lived in the country to move to the city, abandon your farms, abandon your houses, live in the city, and you'll be protected by the walls, and we'll fight them with our navy. And so there's recurrent marches of the Spartans who would sort of go through about half of the Athenian territory, burn the farms, tear down the grapes, till up the soil, and ruin everything, and then they'd leave. Well, if you're a farmer, this kind of is not fun, right? And he's like, look, I just want to go back to my vineyards. I want to go back to the rural life, and I can't because I'm stuck here in the city because of this ridiculous, ruinous war with the Spartans. And it's another one of his themes. Is like, look, our whole way of life is being destroyed. Not just our wealth, not just, our children, but a whole, like our rural existence is not just under threat, it's actually being burnt down. And it's easy for people in the city to vote for the war and to say, oh, we should keep fighting, but how about the people who are bearing the burden of it? So Aristophanes actually puts the guy on stage who can vocalize that. And he's the centerpiece of the play. Again, a hilarious play, by the way, but this is the central tenor of it. Who's paying the price? The people who don't have the voice. I'll give them the voice. Get the city thinking about this. Once again. A second one, then, it's also peace, but the name's pretty obvious there. Also a play about peace. A second one is he had a lot of warnings about demagogues and sophists. One in particular, Cleon. He did not like Cleon. There are several plays, The Horseman in particular, that are structured entirely as assault on one person who was in the audience. So imagine you've gone to see a play, and you're like, wow, Aristophanes, he's funny, sometimes a bit edgy, politically daring, but I'm going to go see his play. And you're sitting there and you realize, oh, well, this is just about me. And everybody in the audience knows it's about you. And the entire play is an abuse, essentially, of one person. And that person, the person he most disliked, was Cleon. In fact, he was so aggressive against Cleon is that the evidence suggests that Cleon took him to court and accused him of treason against the state. Now, if Aristophanes had lost this case, he would have been exiled. Potentially killed, but probably just exiled. And so, having apparently won the case, because he was not exiled, we don't actually have the notes from the case, but we do know that he didn't lose the case, otherwise he would have been exiled, we wouldn't have all the plays. He comes back and writes The Horseman, a play we do have, which is even more brutal than the previous play. I mean, he just goes after him, hammer and tongs. But his charges are clear. Again, it's a hilarious play. The character of Cleon is cast as the smart slave who is abusing the noble citizen and tricking him in every way and taking his money and beating him and doing, he's the slave who gets on top. But he's a crude, nasty, vicious, perverted, self-interested slave. And it goes on, and I just can't imagine being Cleon and sitting in the audience with 10,000, I think like 10,000 people attended these. I mean, huge audience. 10,000 people sitting there going, wow, Aristophanes is just beating Cleon with a stick. How much more of this do we get? Yay. And the evidence, by the way, is that it worked, that he did help Athens overcome its admiration for Cleon. That there is evidence that Cleon's influence faltered in part, not solely, but in part because of the assaults led by Aristophanes. So, I mean, there was some influence here. But his charge was very straightforward. Athens is a democracy, but of a peculiar kind, as all democracies are. And Cleon seemed to have mastered the art of swaying the masses. He's what we would call a demagogue. And he would pack the votes that he needed to win to take power, and then he would make sure that there wasn't anybody there for votes that he needed to then continue holding his power. And so it was a very careful manipulation both of the ideals of the people with demagogic speeches, and also of the methods of voting. So he had mastered both the machinery and the demagoguery to keep the war going. He was specifically, we know this, that Cleon was centrally responsible for not making peace probably twice. That if the Cleon and the faction that he represented had said, yeah, this war is over, let's make peace, there would have been peace. But he consistently resisted that. Because the history shows this is probably true, is that if once there was peace, they were going to get rid of Cleon. Right? So there's very, treacherous water he's sailing in. His life is literally at stake. At least exile. And so he writes an entire play that just assaults him. A couple of the specific charges are hard to understand now, but let me just give you an example. One is that he used his arms to gesticulate when speaking. This was apparently an innovation. And the idea before this is that a true person who's speaking to the mind, who is trying to reason with the populace, wants to be mostly still. Waving your arms around, gesticulating, making a lot of faces, that's what actors do. But if you want to reach the people, you want to reason with them as equals. The whole notion of engaging with a dialogue, which is so strong in the philosophical tradition of Athens at this time, Aristophanes feels that is a fundamental violation of principle. You're not reasoning, you're waving your arms about. Right? It's one of the original notions of like an attack ad. Right? Where are the facts? Where's the truth? No, you're not trying. This is not the point of the attack ad. The attack ad is to run down your enemies. Make them look bad. Who cares? Wave your arms about till you win. And Aristophanes felt this was a fundamental violation of the democratic system because it treated the voters like they were ignorant cattle and misled them. And he hated this. He wanted to appeal to the better natures of the citizenry. So by the way, these sorts of problems are not new to democracy. They have been with us since the inception of democracy. And they show no signs of going away. But this is, many of the jokes in the play are hard to get until you realize that, this is an innovation. Because to be stately and to speak clearly and convincingly without raising your voice and doing lots of gesticulations and all kinds of crazy, vocal faces, all the emotional appeal. You're supposed to have that pretty low boil. And it was supposed to be the reason and the facts that were supposed to triumph, ideally. But Cleon was one of the first who apparently just violated that completely, along with buying factions and all this other manipulation of the democratic process, with which we are quite familiar today. So he hated this. He also disliked sophistry. So another one of his, along with demagoguery, was the idea of convincing people by appealing to their emotions, their fear, their hopes, rather than facts and reason and being grounded in the truth. The second one is he disliked the sophists, which are the people who could argue anything. Right? You could just argue every side of everything and make the weaker argument the better. I think I have that quote here. Yeah, the Horseman. This is from the Horseman. You demagogues are like, oh, and I'm sorry, this is from the horseman, by the way. This is the abuse of Cleon. You demagogues are like the fishers for eels. In still waters they catch nothing. But if they thoroughly stir up the slime, their fishing is good. In the same way, it's only in troubled times that you line your pockets. So this is a double charge. One, if the water is still and you're calm and clear, no one will vote for you. So you're waving your arms around to mix it up, to get the slime up, right? Get the eels up. That's the good stuff. And two, if it's peaceful and calm and there's no war on, well, people don't fall for this crap. It's only when we have fear, only when we're uneasy and scared, that these appeals to our emotions work. So this symbolism works on both levels. Or at least 2 levels, 3 levels actually in the play at this point. But that's the power of his plays consistently. And then from the clouds, which I'll talk about next, which is about the Sophists, a similar idea, which is to invoke solely the weaker argument and yet triumph is an art worth more than 100,000 drachmae. This is what he thought of sophistry. And in the clouds, the king of the Sophists is Socrates. And so a father has a son who has been racing horses and owning horses. It's not so much gambling on horses as just he loves beautiful horses. He's been spending all his money on horses, and so he's deeply in debt. And the father comes up with this plan to say, hey, let's go to the philosophical school of sophistry, and then you can learn how to argue your way out of your debt. And won't that be great? And so the father and the son, they end up going to the school, which is sort of the thinker emporium or something. It's just this made-up Greek word that means something like, thought room or thinkerarium, I think might be close to it. And he says, and he goes in, and up in the air is Socrates floating around in a bucket. So you have to see, it's just this great visual image. So on stage, they have Socrates up floating around in this bucket. And they're doing all kinds of experiments, one of which is they're trying to determine whether a gnat makes a noise from its mouth or its butt. Right? And they've determined that, in fact, it is that noise of the mosquito or the gnat comes from its butt. Because of the direction it moves. They have this long, beautiful chain of reasoning. That means that, of course, the buzzing sound you hear is it farting its way through space, not humming its way through space. And then Socrates is up in this bucket, sort of talking about how he's up in the skies, observing the stars, and if you're too close to the earth. And again, this beautiful sort of preposterous reasoning about the world. And it is an assault, by the way, not so much on Socrates. Socrates is just the guy that everyone would recognize. As it is on the notion of using seeming logic and seeming reason to produce any possible outcome. And at this time, the law courts in Athens, anybody could basically charge anybody with anything at any moment. Right? And so there was constant turmoil of people bringing charges against other people. But pretty quickly, people realized that, wow, it's not so much the evidence that wins the day as the clarity of the presentation of the evidence, as the power of the sophistry. And so people began being hired, essentially, as the first lawyers. They say, look, I'm guilty as hell. All the evidence is against me. Now, help me out. And they would go in and produce the most beautiful, amazing, preposterous, sophistic, is where the word sophistry comes from, arguments. To make the lesser argument look the stronger. To eliminate the debts, to get out of the charge of which you're guilty. So on one hand, it's funny because everybody knew this was kind of going on. On the other hand, Aristophanes felt this was actually a true threat to democracy. It's a true threat when your legal courts are overthrown by this just crazy nonsense. Where there's no actual truth being sought. The powerful who can hire the supposedly wise simply talk their way out of whatever. Finally, in the course of the play, this starts to work for the father, and the son kind of gets into it, and they get some of the debts removed, but then the son beats up the father. By the way, this is a huge violation of all the civil codes of Athens, right? Children revere the parents, the father in particular. Fathers beat children, children don't beat their fathers. So the son beats the father's like, what are you doing? You can't beat me. And he produces this beautifully reasoned argument about how, well, certainly you beat me when I was a child. And the father says, yes. Well, I know you beat me because it was good for me for you to beat me. And so if beatings are therefore good, then it would be good for me to return the favor of your goodness onto you, tenfold, and to beat the hell out of you. Right? And so the son has learned the arguments only too well. And so again, there's a series of these hilarious scenes, but the implication is quite clear, which is if you allow this sort of reasoning to go on, reasoning in quotes, if you allow sophists to just prove anything, then what you're going to get is chaos. Children beating parents, debts not being paid, masses being misled, democracy in the courts ruined. You see another version of this in the Wasp, which is, again, it's just, I should stop and say these plays are just so damn funny. I'm making them sound way too serious because they have this serious component, but I'm overemphasizing it because it's been underemphasized for roughly the last 1,000 years. But just as an example, there's a chorus in Greek plays. Oh, by the way, did I mention comedy comes from the Greek word komos, which is to revel or riot or party, and dea, which is to sing. So it's a revel with songs. It's a singing party. It's a festive occasion. So they have these big choruses that would sing, and the evidence suggests that the audience would know the songs, or they would be songs to common tunes, and so everybody would sing along. But in the Wasps, or the Hornets, as it's sometimes translated, the chorus is dressed as wasps with big striped suits on, and they have stingers, and they all waddle around stinging everybody with their butts all the time, right? And they keep entering as this big mass of wasps and hornets. But in this play, the central concept is there's a father who loves to go to the trials, which is where all the big cases are decided, which is great, because this is participatory democracy at its finest. But his son points out correctly, as it turns out, look, Dad, one, you're wasting your time and you're being misled and misused by the system. You think you're making the decisions. You think you have power. You think you have control. But in fact, and Aristophanes gives this brilliant critique through the voice of the son, you're just being used as a lever to get the votes that the oligarchs basically want anyway. It's just, again, it's this powerful critique of how people in democracies are misled. But because it's Aristophanes, you also get the counter critique. We actually like the father much better, even though he's wrong in the play. He's a great character. Because he's like, no, I love to go to trials. I love to serve the state. I love to participate. It's something for me to do. Even though I'm an old man, I can do my part. And the son says, no, stop that. You're wasting your life. You don't really have any power. But what does the son offer? Nothing. He actually is just basically a drunken bastard. Right? And so this is Aristophanes, he's not going to just go, he's like, you can either be misused or a drunken bastard. No, we got to be able to do better than that. He's saying, yeah, the courts are corrupt, but that doesn't mean you just leave the courts. You don't just throw up your hands and say, well, that's it, forget it, it's just stupid. It's like, no, we need more participation, not less participation. And so you get all these hilarious scenes. I think maybe one of the funniest ones in all of his plays is the father is so addicted to the courts that the son barricades him in his house. So the opening scene is him coming up through a chimney and coming up through roof tiles and trying to climb out windows so that he can get to the trial because he so much wants to participate. So the son finally holds a trial of a bucket? Now I'm trying to remember. Anyway, all of the furniture comes to life. And so the bucket is being tried by a chair, and but they're people dressed up as buckets and chairs, and so they're all on stage dancing around, and there's this big, and all these speeches are given in defense, and and the broom is, arguing with the bucket, and it's this whole sort of faux show trial of furniture with the father there sitting in the jury, and he's loving to participate, and it's just these beautiful, crazy, madcap scenes, but again, on a serious subject. Another one, or sort of one of the last ones here, is his support for democracy. And you see this in the Frogs, Wasps, women at the assembly, and again the Acarnians. One of the challenges in any democratic system is who gets to vote, what do they have to do to vote, how often do you vote, and what do you get to vote on? We tend not to think about these things because we say, oh, we have a democracy, well, that's great. And then, hey, there you go. Well, who gets to vote? How many votes are there? How many votes do you need? When do you vote? So several of the jokes that he had, which were apparently quite serious, is they would schedule votes often, well, they scheduled them early in the morning because you knew what time it is, but they would also schedule them on days when not a lot of people could be there. So if you wanted to pass a vote, you just voted when nobody would be there or very few people could show up. And then you voted on whatever you wanted with your people, packed the assembly, and then boom, you're done. Passed. Is that fair? Is that good? Is that democracy? And who can afford to vote? So we say, oh, you can participate in democracy, but if you have to stop work and travel to Athens to stand in an assembly for half a day to vote on something, well, that's very expensive, except for the people who happen to live in Athens and have nothing to do. So on one hand, yeah, everybody gets to participate. On the other hand, some of these rules were not necessarily real helpful towards participation. I was actually thinking of this because I don't know if people know they just had big sort of political turmoil in Brazil recently, but Brazil has mandatory voting. They're a democracy, but you have to vote. You have no choice. Compulsory voting. You have to vote. What an interesting idea, right? That if everybody has to vote, and you get, 90 or 100% participation because it's required, it's mandated, you can in theory get in trouble if you don't. Wow, that's very different from a system in which, well, if you have your paperwork filled out, you can vote, but you don't have to. But in ancient Greece, it was much, there were barriers to voting. And throughout Aristophanes' life, he argued that these barriers should be lowered and that the franchise should be increased. First, he argues, you see this in the frogs in particular, and the Acanians, by the way, that resident aliens in Athens should be given the right to participate in the democracy. Because these are people who have been there for generations and generations. These aren't people who just showed up 10 days ago. So just imagine, I know it's hard to imagine, but let's imagine you had a lot of people who came to your country who weren't necessarily citizens, and they didn't become citizens, but they had children in your country, right? I know it's hard to imagine this would happen, but let's just imagine that happens. And there's a lot of them around, maybe a few million in today's demographic terms relative to Athens. Would you want them to participate in your democracy? Aristophanes said yes, because the larger the franchise, the more people are invested in your democracy, the better it is. It's a counterbalance to what he thought was both demagoguery and tyranny in the oligarchs. It goes so far, finally, to argue, look, we should let freed slaves vote. Now, this is a big step forward. Athens suffered a serious naval setback against the Spartans, which means now they're doomed, because if they're not going to win on land, and if they're not winning on the sea, they're in trouble. So they needed to get rowers, and they needed to get rowers right now. And so they offered slaves a deal. They said, if you will come row, because citizens did this before, if you will come row in the navy and basically risk your life and fight for the city, if we win, we'll make you free. And if you become free, you should get the vote, right? And so this was a huge potential increase in the franchise. And Aristophanes pushes this very hard in his plays. And it's a real issue facing the city of Athens, facing the Greek culture. And Aristophanes was, again, I would say, right. I mean, history proved that he was right. This turned out to actually be a pretty damn good idea and staved off the inevitable, at least for a little while, although not forever. Women at the assembly is exactly what you would expect it to be. The joke of the play is the women get so sick of the men running the place, like in Lysistrata, that instead of going on a sex strike and taking the bank, they dress up as men, and they go to the assembly to vote in the place of men. So they're going to pack the assembly to vote for good things rather than the crap that the men have been passing. And one of the jokes of the play is they didn't really let women on stage in the Greek theater. So the female parts were played by young men dressed up in women's suits, clothing with breasts and everything. So now you have young men dressed as women dressing as men. Right? So there's this whole double set of costuming things going on here, which is just going to be hilarious, right? And then the women, of course, have no concept of how the assembly works, and so much hilarity ensues. But the big joke is how crazy this would be. Now, people have argued that, Aristophanes was really a big proponent of women's rights. The evidence for that is not very strong. It's just that in his time, it was so hilarious to think that women would be in the assembly that it makes the thing funny. Imagine it. His real message, though, not real message, part of the message, though, is look, it's so bad, we're being so badly led that we would be better off if the women ran it. Which is both a joke and a threat. Good Lord, how badly off do you have to be when you would want women to participate? You know, and so some of his plays seem like they have this feminist overtone. I'm not sure. Very scant evidence of this. But there's a lot of evidence of, again, his proposals for peace. He was sensitive to the position women were in. Again, in Lysistrata, I believe it's Lysistrata who says, look, men go to war, maybe they die once, maybe they don't. Women, one, we lose our husbands, two, we lose our children, and if you're a young woman, who are you supposed to marry? As you get old, your spring is done. The men come back, they can marry anybody they want because there's so few men and so many women. We are losing over and over and over again. It's a very sensitive recognition that the problem women have is very different, very unique. Not the same problems that men have in the war. And so this, he does have that outlook, but not he's, again, I think it's very weak that he's sort of a proto-feminist, but it's very strong that he recognized the issues that faced his country. And then the frogs, which is beautiful. Let's see, how should I? Boy, that's a tough one to. Well, the frogs. Dionysus goes down to hell to get Euripides, and Aristophanes spends lots and lots of time in his plays assaulting Euripides because he thought Euripides was hilarious because they often wrote about similar things, but Euripides' plays were horrible, and he never won the top prizes. Right? The Athenians hated Euripides' plays, and so a lot of Aristophanes' jokes are Euripides. Come on, you can't do it this way. Euripides wrote tragedies that were horrifying. So, for instance, the classic one is the Medea, where at the end of the play, Medea kills her own children, poisons the girlfriend of her husband, kills the queen of the colony they're in, and escapes and lives at the end. Which violates essentially all the rules of tragedy and right and everything. It's like horrifying. It's a great play, by the way. Medea, my ideal woman. She was the business. But you just didn't want to cross her. This is the thing. You wanted to, be careful if your wife is Medea. Jason is just beautifully awful as a husband. He's a wonderful character. But so Euripides didn't, I don't think he may have won one first prize, but he often did not win first prize. These were competitive plays, by the way. They were done like a sporting event. So they would give 3 or 4 of them in a row, then people would vote, and whoever got top prize, that was great. But Euripides was consistently not getting top prize. And so Aristophanes sort of makes fun of him. But after Euripides dies, he has a play in which he sends Dionysus to hell to get Euripides back, because there's no good playwrights left now that Euripides is dead. Which suggests, as much as Aristophanes loves making fun of him, he really did like Euripides' work. He's just like, look, you're not going to win if you do it this way. You want to make them laugh, not make them weep or be terrified. I think this is one of the messages. But a big part of the play is them like rowing across the river Styx, and the meeting of the old values of the Athenian civilization that fought successfully against the Persians, allied with the Spartans. They were allied with the Spartans against the Persian invasions. Not the new world, where we're fighting the Spartans. And so there's this whole undercurrent in this of, I'm going to get Euripides. What I'm trying to do is get the old world back. Bring it back with me. So we can go back to the old values, back to the way things were before we just started to destroy it with demagoguery. It's also in the Frogs where he brings up the threats, quite specifically, of an oligarchy or a tyranny taking over Athens. His timing was very precise. I mean, he missed it by a little bit, but it wasn't too long after this that, in fact, the tyranny of the 500 and then the 4,000 takes over. So it's a strikingly clear view of the threats that Athens was facing once again. And his solution, or his solution to the extent that he offered solutions, he mostly offered critiques and cries for, hey, let's do something different, was, look, let's expand the franchise. Let's include more people. Let's bring about peace. Let's negotiate. Let's work out our problems. Not let's just continue what we're doing. And so you get these this real, again, poignant, funny. I mean, one of the great scenes in there, I guess I should mention, it's hard, again, I'll go back to the humor. So Dionysus is Hercules' brother. Hercules has gone to hell and come back. Nobody else has. And so Dionysus, who is sort of wears long flowing robes like a woman and big hat. This is how you recognize Dionysus on the stage. Dresses up as Hercules, who wears like a tiger skin and has a club. That's how you recognize Hercules on stage. And goes to knock on Hercules' door. And so Hercules answers the door and is like, holy shit, what the hell is that? Right? And so there's Dionysus in Hercules garb. And it's just this repeatedly hilarious encounters because Dionysus is not Hercules. Dionysus is fainting away at best. He's just not the warrior type. And so he's trying to avoid battle all the time. And it turns out to be all these jokes about generals who don't fight and, sort of politicians who are leading very strongly from the rear. It's subtle, but it's consistently there. And so throughout Aristophanes, you get this, again, consistently hilarious and consistently powerful critique of Athenian society. And I wouldn't say he was a great thinker, except for he was right all the time. History proved that Aristophanes was right. Cleon was a dangerous demagogue who got them into all kinds of trouble. Their war with Sparta was ruinous and did lead to weakening the entire Greek world and opening up to conquest from the outside. The threats of internal oligarchy were very strong. The rip-off of the people and the jury-rigging of the franchise created all kinds of democratic problems. The whole structure had these issues, and he labeled them. He identified them. He screened them. And again, it's important to remember that these hilarious plays were performed in front of the most important people in Athenian society. And he's, again, in plays, he named Cleon. And then later, instead of naming Cleon, he just made it clear that the guy was Cleon, who he was mocking. He turned, Lysistrata, in the line I quote, turns to the audience and says, don't laugh, I'll hit you with my slipper. Which is very rude, by the way. This is an incredibly rude gesture, but also be threatened from a woman from stage. Like, I'll hit you. I'll come out there and hit you, so shut up. Right? It's a direct assault on the audience, but again, funny. I was trying to think of the close analogy I could come up with, and it would sort of be, I was thinking maybe like MASH, which was kind of a show that was funny, and it was set in Korea to critique America's involvement in Vietnam. That was it. The only difference would be is the war was going on. Athens was often, threatened by Sparta while the play was being performed, and the actual generals and leaders were there when Aristophanes assaulted them in a hilarious, entertaining fashion. He won over and over again, by the way. He wrote something like 44 plays, 11 of which are extant. We still have. So when you think of Aristophanes, if you think of Aristophanes, first think of him as one of the top playwrights of all time, particularly for comedy. If you want to read a couple of them, The Frogs is a great place to start. Lysistrata, of course, a classic. The Wasps, hilarious. But you also have to remember that we're missing a lot. What exactly the chorus and the dancers were doing all the time. I mean, we know they were doing funny stuff because it's Aristophanes, but exactly what that was, we don't know. A lot of evidence that the audience was singing along, like drinking songs. Right? They're all just There would be breaks for musical numbers, right? Sort of big musical interlude now, and then they would go. It's clearest in the frogs. There's a whole section in the frogs where it's pretty clear that this was a musical number, and the audience would sing, that we're all singing together here. So there's a whole musical element there as well to sort of bring people up. Crazy costumes, I mean, hilarious. He had giants, he had people in buckets, he had going to the underworld, he had lions and tigers on stage, he had the sort of famous, two people in the horse's body thing. He had one of those. It goes all the way back. It seems newish, but it's not. It's ancient. But he didn't have a system. And I think this is, again, to go back to where I started, Aristophanes doesn't seem like a thinker in the sense of, wow, he didn't create a model government which he suggested that Athens should adopt. He didn't say, here's a new constitution which I feel should be voted on by the citizens, because A, this would be boring and unfunny, and he was going to be funny at all costs. But two, it's not clear that that works in any case. He wasn't a revolutionary, right? He didn't say, I want to overthrow everything, I want to destroy everything, I want to burn everything down, we're going to start it new. That was Plato. Plato in the Republic, right? Level this, adopt something new, an ideal, and terrifying, by the way. My God, is that a terrifying idea. Aristophanes, on the other hand, said, look, we've got a pretty good system. It's not all bad, but we have problems. I'm going to lay them out for you. And again, where I read before, even a comedy knows what's right, and I'll say, though startling, is right. I'm going to tell you what's right. You know I'm right. Laugh along, but you know I'm right. He just says it right there, right in the middle of a play. Even now, you silly men, it is not too late to change your ways. We can still fix this. I don't want to overthrow it. I don't want to burn it down. I don't want to create an ideal state. I just want to fix the one we have. We can do this. The poet declares he deserves to receive rewards for the good he has done you. I've done you so much good, you should reward me. By the way, this is precisely the line that Socrates takes in his trial. He says, look, I've done so much good to the city. What should my punishment be? My punishment should be, you should pay me tribute. Put a statue up to me, because I'm such a great guy and I've helped the city out so much. I'm semi-convinced he stole it from Aristophanes, because Aristophanes said it first. And Aristophanes was put on trial. He was threatened. Cleon was not his friend. He did risk a lot to do this. And he did it for years and years and years. So here's a humane person who was right, who wanted to uplift, entertain, and reform his society. That we've forgotten because we don't think of comedy as sufficiently serious. So anyway, Aristophanes, forgotten thinkers, thank you very much.